thousands of years ago, before cities rose and before history was written, an ancient shoreline began to disappear beneath rising water. Camps, paths, fishing grounds, and perhaps entire communities were swallowed by a flood so vast that some scholars believe it may have changed the course of human memory forever. Was this the disaster behind some of the world's oldest flood stories, or just one piece of a much larger mystery hidden beneath the sea? Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy ancient mysteries, lost worlds, and the forgotten disasters that shaped human history. At first, there is only a line on the land, a pale strip of shells, reeds, and wet stones marks the edge of a great inland water, and beyond it the ground rises in low folds of grass and scrub. People know this shore the way people know the path from a doorway to a hearth. They know where the river mud holds footprints after rain, where fish gather in the shallows, and where birds lift from the marsh at dawn. It is not a kingdom, it is not yet a city, it is a lived landscape. Nets drying on branches, fires banked under ash, stones chosen for cutting, seeds carried from one season to another. Then the water begins to change the meaning of everything. It does not need to arrive like a wave taller than a house to become a disaster. Sometimes the most frightening thing water can do is keep coming. A shoreline that stood beyond the reeds yesterday lies nearer today. A familiar bank slumps away. The old path to the fishing place turns soft, then vanishes beneath brown water. People pull back, carrying what they can and abandoning what they cannot. A hearth can be rebuilt. A grave cannot be moved so easily. A memory rooted to a bend in the river does not travel cleanly. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because the story ahead is not only about a flood, it is about the moment a world became unreachable. Far beneath the modern Black Sea, under dark water and layers of sediment, there are places that once felt ordinary. That is the first unsettling truth. The bottom of the sea is not only a bottom. In many places around the world, it is a drowned archive of human ground. Old riverbeds cut across it. Ancient beaches lie below present waves. Shelves that once held animals, camps, trees, and tracks now sit in silence beneath fish and cold currents. What looks from above like one continuous body of water is, in part, a roof over former valleys, where earlier people walked without imagining that the horizon itself would move inland. The megaflood connected with the Black Sea has become one of the most haunting versions of this deeper story. Scholars still debate how sudden it was, how high the old water level stood, how violently the sea entered, and how many people were directly affected. The evidence remains incomplete, scattered across cores of mud, shells from different kinds of water, submerged shorelines, and the difficult silence of places that cannot be excavated like a dry village. Yet the central image remains powerful because it rests on something real at the end of the Ice Age. Coasts were not fixed lines. Seas rose. Lakes expanded or broke their rims. Rivers changed course. Lands that had held generations of human use disappeared within the span of real families and real loss. To imagine the beginning, it helps to strip the modern world away. There is no port of Istanbul glittering above the Bosporus, no freighters moving through the straits, no maps naming the Black Sea as a settled fact. There is instead a basin ringed by rivers and hills, a lower world where water gathers in a broad dark bowl. Marshes draw birds in seasonal clouds. Herd animals move through open country beyond the shore. People follow fish runs. They gather plants. Some experiment with cultivation. Others begin to live more steadily near rich water and fertile margins. What survives in the record suggests that shorelines are among the most attractive places humans have ever known, and also among the most vulnerable. There is a strange cruelty in that. The places that feed people best are often the first to be taken. A low coast offers reeds for weaving, fish for traps, shellfish for food and ornaments, fresh water nearby, and open views across the water. It invites return. Over years, return becomes attachment. Over generations, it becomes belonging. Then the water rises, and the advantages turn against them. Low ground gives way first. Channels deepen. Salt may creep into places where fresh water mattered. A settlement can lose its edges before it loses its centre. This is why the image of a single tremendous flood has such force. It gives shape to something otherwise too large and slow to hold in the mind. Human beings remember stories better than gradients. A shoreline rising by handspans becomes in memory a day when the water came. But the scientific problem is harder than a simple legend. Did Mediterranean water pour through a natural threshold and race into the lower Black Sea basin with catastrophic speed? Or did the change unfold in stages? Advancing over longer time, were people forced to flee from a roaring inland sea? Or were they responding to a creeping loss of shore, the kind that makes every return slightly less safe? No single explanation fully accounts for every clue, and the uncertainty is part of the mystery rather than a weakness in it. What can be said is that water changed the human world. Somewhere along those ancient margins, a person may have watched a known place vanish and understood that the ground itself had become unreliable. The old signs failed. A tree that marked the edge of a camp stood half drowned. A line of stones placed around a fire disappeared under silt. Animal tracks ended at water. Generations later, nothing remained visible. The reeds grew elsewhere. The birds followed the marsh inland. The people carried memory in directions that the water allowed. Today, the sea gives back only fragments. A shell here, a drowned channel there, a chemical shift in mud, a shape on the seafloor that suggests an older beach. These are quiet clues, not the grand ruins of a palace or temple, and yet they may speak of a turning point as profound as any collapse of kings. Long before written histories, human beings were already facing landscape change. They could not command it. They could only read it, fear it, adapt to it, and sometimes run before it. The mega-flood that may have transformed the Black Sea matters because it stands at the border between memory and geology. It begins with a drowned shore, but it does not end there. Under that dark surface lies the first question of the whole mystery: how much of human history has vanished not because people failed, but because the world they knew sank quietly beneath the sea. The reason so much human ground now lies below the sea begins far from any shore, in places so cold and vast that they seem almost outside ordinary history. During the height of the last ice age, enormous ice sheets rest over northern lands like continents made of frozen weight. They cover much of North America, northern Europe, and great stretches of Asia's high latitudes. Mountain glaciers push down valleys. Snow falls and does not fully melt, year after year, until weather becomes architecture. Water that might once have flowed through rivers into the ocean is trapped in ice, locked above the land in such quantities that the shape of the planet changes. The oceans fall, not by a few inches, not by the height of a man, but by more than 100 meters at the coldest stages. That number can sound clean and simple, but on the ground it means an entirely different Earth. Coastlines move outward. Continental shelves emerge as plains. Islands become hills. Straits become valleys. Land bridges appear where ships now pass over deep water. A person walking through that world would not think of it as temporary exposure. It would seem solid, normal, inherited. Children would be born on land that modern people know only from sonar maps. This lower sea world is one of the great hidden stages of prehistory. It holds the edges of human migration and survival, but most of it is unreachable in the usual archaeological sense. The best campsites, the richest fishing grounds, the easiest paths along water, and the earliest coastal stopping places may now be buried under waves. Archaeologists can excavate caves, dry river terraces, and inland camps, but the old shorelines are often gone from sight. The evidence remains incomplete because the sea has covered not only objects, but entire patterns of movement. For Ice Age humans, the world is cold, but not empty. It is sharper, wider, and in many places drier. Great herbivores move across open steppe and tundra, mammoths, horses, reindeer, bison, and other animals follow seasonal grasses across immense distances. People follow them too, not as helpless wanderers but as careful readers of weather, tracks, stone, fire, bone, and water. They know where flint can be found. They know which valleys funnel animals. They know how wind behaves on exposed ground. What survives in the record suggests a species already capable of memory over distance, planning across seasons, and adjusting to landscapes that can be generous one year and deadly the next. Yet even in a cold world, shorelines matter. Rivers still carry fish, wetlands still gather birds, lakes still freeze and thaw in patterns that can be read. The margins of water offer food diversity that open steppe does not always provide. Shells, reeds, freshwater fish, migrating birds, edible plants, and trapped animals draw people toward edges. This may be one reason the disappearance of ancient coasts is so important. The sea did not merely cover empty margins. It may have covered some of the most attractive, repeated, and culturally meaningful places people used. Around the Black Sea basin, the Ice Age world is especially complicated. It is not simply a smaller version of the modern sea. The basin has its own story of rivers, thresholds, salinity, and changing connections with the Mediterranean. At different times, the waters of the Black Sea region may have stood lower, fresher, or more isolated than they do today. Rivers such as the Danube, Dniester, Dnieper, Don, and others feed enormous amounts of fresh water into the basin and its surrounding systems. Depending on climate and sea level, the balance between river inflow, evaporation, and outside connection can change the character of the water itself. Scholars still debate the details, but the wider pattern is clear: the basin is sensitive to the condition of the whole planet. That sensitivity matters because a low sea is not only a lower line on a map, it creates new living space. Imagine a broad shore lying below the modern waterline, edged by marshes and river mouths. There may be sandbars, mudflats, reed beds, and small elevations safe enough for camps or more lasting settlement. Animals come to drink. Fish gather where fresh water meets a larger body of water. Paths form because people return, and return because the place rewards them. Over time, repeated use becomes difficult to separate from home. A lesser-known detail of this Ice Age world is that many exposed coastal plains were not barren beaches, but complex environments. The continental shelves could hold rivers, lakes, forests in warmer pockets, grasslands, marshes, and migration corridors. In some regions, they were among the best places to live. When the water later rose, It did not simply erase a boundary. It erased landscapes with internal geography, with landmarks, hazards, and remembered routes. The map of human life was once broader than the map we can easily excavate. Still, the frozen balance cannot last forever. Ice sheets are not permanent walls. They respond to sunlight, temperature, ocean circulation, and atmospheric shifts across thousands of years. When the climate begins to warm, the water held in ice begins its long return. At first, it may happen unevenly, with pulses, pauses, reversals, and regional surprises. A glacier retreats here while cold lingers there. A meltwater lake grows behind an ice dam. A river changes its path. A coast creeps inland. To people living through it, there is no global chart, no curve showing sea level rise. There is only experience a place harder to cross than before, a spring flood stronger than remembered, a marsh wider than it used to be. This is the quiet foundation of the later catastrophe. Before any sudden breach, before any proposed torrent through the Bosporus, before flood memories take form in story, the planet has already set the stage. The oceans are low because the ice is high. Human communities have spread across lands made available by cold. Some of those lands lie close to water, rich with food and meaning. They seem as durable as any homeland ever seems, but their existence depends on a frozen bargain made elsewhere. When that bargain breaks, the sea begins to collect what the Ice Age borrowed from it. The first disaster is not the roar of water, but the simple fact that the world people trust is only temporarily above the waves. The thaw does not begin as a single clean turning point. It is not one spring morning when the Ice Age simply ends and the world exhales. It comes unevenly, with hesitation and violence, with warm intervals followed by cold returns, with landscapes responding at different speeds. In one region, a glacier shrinks back from a valley and leaves raw stone exposed to light for the first time in thousands of years. In another, cold winds still move over open steppe as if nothing has changed. Farther south, trees begin to creep into places that had long belonged to grass and tundra. The planet is warming, but it is warming like a body waking from a fever, restless, unstable, and not yet sure of its own rhythm. Across the northern world, ice sheets begin to lose their grip, their edges drip, crack, and retreat. Meltwater runs in silver threads at first, then in brown torrents filled with groundstone, gravel, and the memory of everything the ice has crushed beneath it. Rivers swell with seasonal force. Valleys that were once locked under frozen weight become channels of moving water. New lakes form against ice margins, held back by dams made not of stone or timber, but of ice itself. These lakes can appear immense, temporary and dangerous. They gather behind barriers that seem solid until they fail, and when they fail, entire inland seas can drain with terrifying speed. No single explanation fully accounts for every meltwater pulse known from this period, but the pattern is unmistakable. The late Ice Age world is full of water looking for a way out. This is one of the lesser-known features of the thaw. People often imagine sea level rise as an ocean slowly swelling upward, but some of the most dramatic events begin inland. Ice-dammed lakes burst. Rivers abandon old beds. Meltwater carves new routes through landscapes still soft from glacial pressure. In parts of North America, Europe, and Asia, enormous volumes of water move across country in sudden releases, leaving scoured ground, giant ripples, stripped valleys, and sediment fans behind. These are not myths. They are geological scars. The scale is difficult to hold in the mind, because modern experience rarely prepares anyone for floods that behave like moving landscapes rather than temporary disasters. For human communities, this creates a world of changing opportunities and changing dangers. Warmer conditions can bring more plants, more varied animals, longer growing seasons, and new routes through country once blocked by ice. Forests spread, lakes and wetlands multiply, rivers become richer in fish. The world may feel less brutally cold, but it also becomes less predictable. A hunting ground that once opened wide across steppe begins to fill with trees. Herds shift their routes. Animals adapted to open cold lands move away, shrink in number, or vanish from local memory. People must learn new prey, new plants, new paths, and new risks. Adaptation is not a grand idea here. It is a daily discipline. At the same time, the oceans begin to reclaim their old basins. Water that had been stored for millennia in ice returns to the sea. Coastlines creep inland, sometimes slowly enough to seem like a problem for descendants, sometimes fast enough to disrupt a lifetime. Low plains become marshes. Marshes become lagoons. Lagoons become open water. Islands separate from mainlands. River mouths drown and shift. The human map, never written on paper for these communities, is rewritten through lived experience. A route that grandparents walked becomes a crossing by boat. A campsite becomes a fishing ground. A graveyard becomes unreachable. What survives in the record suggests that the end of the Ice Age was not only a climate event, but a long crisis of orientation. In the Black Sea region, the consequences of this global thaw are especially tangled. The basin sits in a position where distant changes can arrive through narrow thresholds. The Mediterranean, the Sea of Marmara, the Bosporus, river inflow, rainfall, evaporation, and the level of the basin itself all matter. A shift in one part of the system can change the balance of another. If global sea level rises outside the basin, the pressure on connecting passages changes. If rivers pour more fresh water into the Black Sea basin, its level can rise from within. If climate becomes drier, the basin may fall or become more isolated. Scholars still debate the precise sequence, and the evidence remains incomplete because the most important margins lie underwater. But the Black Sea is clearly not a passive bowl. It is a sensitive instrument, responding to the thawing world around it. To people living near its ancient shores, none of this would appear as geology. It would appear as weather that no longer behaves, as rivers that flood differently, as animals that arrive late or not at all, as shorelines that move from the place where memory says they should be. There may be years when the water seems almost calm, and years when storms eat the banks with unusual hunger. There may be seasons when fresh water spreads through reed beds, and other seasons when unfamiliar water changes the taste of a place. The signs would not always be clear, and that may be part of the terror. Catastrophe is easier to understand after it has already happened. Beforehand, it often looks like a collection of strange exceptions. This is the age when human life itself begins to change in profound ways. In the wider Near East and surrounding regions, some communities are experimenting more deeply with plants, animals, storage, and settlement. They're not yet civilizations in the later sense, not kingdoms with armies and monuments, but they are already altering their relationship with place. Staying longer in one landscape creates new benefits and new vulnerabilities. A mobile group can leave a dangerous shore more easily than a community with stored food, built structures, tended plots, and ancestors buried nearby. The more people invest in a place, the more painful it becomes when the place begins to fail them. The thaw therefore carries a contradiction. It opens new worlds even as it destroys old ones. It turns ice margins into rivers, cold plains into forests, dry shelves into sea, and familiar shores into submerged memory. It gives humans the chance to expand, experiment, gather, cultivate, and settle more intensely, while also reminding them that no landscape is promised. By the time the proposed Black Sea flood enters the story, the planet has already been teaching this lesson for thousands of years. The water does not arrive from nowhere. It comes as part of a larger return, as the frozen world releases its hold and the sea begins, patiently and sometimes violently, to take back its shape. Before the Black Sea becomes the Black Sea of modern maps, before its dark surface carries ships, borders, ports, and the long memory of empires, it exists as something more uncertain, a basin of changing water, ringed by rivers, plains, marshes, and low shores that do not match the coastline known today. To stand there in the centuries after the Ice Age is to stand inside a world still deciding what it will become. The air is milder than it had been in the coldest millennia. Forests are spreading into some valleys. Open grasslands still remain in others. Rivers descend from distant highlands and pour into the basin, carrying silt, fish, driftwood, and the seasonal pulse of lands far beyond sight. This is not a dead depression waiting to be filled. It is a living landscape. The old Black Sea basin may have held a large lake or a lower body of water with conditions different from the modern sea. Scholars still debate exactly how fresh or brackish it was at different times, how far below modern sea level its surface stood, and how its changing chemistry should be read from shells and sediments. But the broader picture is clear enough to be haunting. The shoreline was once farther out. Places now drowned beneath deep water were once edges of land. A person could walk where only fish now pass. River mouths would have cut across exposed shelves before meeting the lower basin, creating wetlands and channels where animals, birds, and humans would naturally gather. It is tempting to imagine this world as empty because it is hard to see. Modern water hides it completely, and absence can trick the mind into thinking nothing was there. But the edges of water have always pulled people close. Around such a basin, life could concentrate in ways that leave only faint traces once submerged. Camps might have stood on slightly raised ground above reed beds. Small groups might have returned season after season to fish, gather plants, hunt water birds, and watch migrating animals move through the surrounding country. Fires could have burned beside the shore at dusk while insects rose from the marsh and birds settled into the reeds. Nothing about such a place needs stone walls or temples to matter. A landscape can be culturally important long before it becomes architecturally impressive. The rivers are central to this hidden world. The Danube, the Dnieper, the Dniester, the Don, and other waterways link distant environments to the basin's edge. They are corridors as much as watercourses, guiding animals, people, plants, and ideas. Along rivers, movement becomes easier. Stone from one region can travel into another. Techniques can spread without anyone planning a great migration. A family group may follow a river valley for food and find themselves at the margin of a great inland water. Another group may move away from the shore and carry with them stories of fish runs, storms, flooded flats, and the strange moods of the basin. What survives in the record suggests that such river-connected landscapes were never isolated in the simple sense. They were stitched into wider human worlds. This low Black Sea world would also have been rich in thresholds. Fresh water from rivers met the broader basin. Marsh met grassland. Forest margins met open country. High ground overlooked low, wet flats. These boundaries create variety, and variety creates resilience. When hunting fails, fish may still be caught. When one plant is scarce, another may ripen nearby. When large animals move away, birds may still pass overhead in huge seasonal numbers. This diversity is one reason humans are drawn to ecotones, the meeting places between environments. A lesser-known detail of prehistory is that some of the most important human landscapes were not dramatic mountains or obvious strongholds, but edges, coastlines, lake shores, estuaries, and river mouths where many food sources overlap. Yet edges are unstable by nature. The same marsh that feeds people can shift after a wet year. The same channel that guides boats or walking routes can fill with silt. A low camp can become uninhabitable after repeated flooding. The lower Black Sea basin, sensitive to climate and water balance, would have made this instability part of life. People living there may not have considered it unusual. They would have known that shorelines breathe with seasons, storms, and river floods. But there is a difference between a shoreline that breathes and a shoreline that migrates beyond return. That difference may not be obvious at first. It reveals itself slowly through the failure of familiar expectations. In this world, early human communities are not frozen in one ancient mode of life. Across nearby regions, the late prehistoric period sees experimentation with more settled living, plant management, animal relationships, storage, and increasingly complex social ties. The Black Sea margins may have interacted with these broader transformations, though the evidence remains incomplete. Some groups likely remained highly mobile. Others may have spent longer periods in favoured places. Still others may have combined seasonal movement with repeated use of productive shore sites. It is important not to force a single pattern onto them. Human life at this time is flexible, and flexibility is one of the reasons people survive. The shore itself would have contained memory. A bend in a river marks where fish are trapped in spring. A stand of trees marks shade, fuel, and shelter. A rise above the reeds marks a safe place to sleep. A cluster of stones marks the remains of work, food, or ritual. Perhaps there are burials in dry ground not far from water, though direct evidence for such places beneath the modern sea is difficult to recover. Perhaps there are stories attached to certain coves or channels, passed down not as formal myth but as practical knowledge. The evidence cannot give back voices, but it can remind us that submerged land was not blank land. This is why the proposed flood, whether sudden or more gradual, matters so deeply. It did not threaten a nameless emptiness. It threatened an inhabited geography, a world of roots and resources, of remembered camps and repeated returns. Even if the number of people was not enormous by later standards, the loss could still have been immense for those who lived there. A small community does not need a city to experience catastrophe. It only needs a place that holds its dead, feeds its children, and tells its members who they are. So the low Black Sea world waits at the centre of the story like a room before the door opens. Around it, rivers continue to pour in. Beyond it, the Mediterranean world is rising with the returning oceans. Between them lies the narrow region of thresholds and straits, where geology can turn a difference in water level into destiny. The basin is full of life, but it is also vulnerable because it sits below a changing world. The stage is not empty. The shore is known. The water is lower. And somewhere beyond the horizon of local memory, another sea is climbing. Between the rising Mediterranean world and the lower Black Sea basin lies a narrow, complicated wound in the land the Bosporus. Today it is easy to see it as a famous waterway, a passage between continents, a place where cities, empires, ships, and histories crowd together. But before all that, it is a threshold. It is not merely a gap on a map. It is a geological hinge, a place where the fate of one basin can depend on the level of another, on one side. The waters connected to the global ocean rise as the Ice Age melts. On the other, the Black Sea basin sits lower, fed by rivers and shaped by its own uncertain balance. Between them stands a barrier that may, for a time, have held two worlds apart. A threshold can be quiet for centuries and still become the most important feature in a landscape. People living along the old shores may have known nothing of the precise difference in water level beyond the southwestern rim of the basin. They would not have measured the Mediterranean climbing toward them. They may not have imagined that another sea, beyond hills and channels and rocky ground, was pressing toward a connection. Yet geology does not require witnesses to prepare a disaster. Water rises where climate sends it. It tests low places. It searches for weakness. It gathers behind barriers with a patience that can look almost harmless until the moment the barrier no longer matters. The proposed breaking of the Bosporus threshold is the dramatic heart of the Black Sea flood idea. According to the most catastrophic version, the Mediterranean, or waters connected through the Sea of Marmara, finally overtopped or cut through the natural sill and began pouring northward into the lower basin. If the Black Sea level was far below the outside sea, the difference could have created a powerful inflow. Not a gentle joining of waters, but a sustained transfer from one world into another. In this view, the basin did not merely rise because rain and rivers fed it. It was invaded by the sea. The image is almost impossible not to picture salt water pushing through a narrow passage, cutting deeper, accelerating, carrying foam, sediment, uprooted debris, and the force of a distant ocean returning to land it had lost during the Ice Age. But scholars still debate the details intensely. Some reconstructions suggest a sudden and enormous influx. Others argue for a more gradual reconnection, or for water levels that were not different enough to produce the most extreme flood scenarios. The evidence remains incomplete because the threshold itself has changed. The seafloor has been reworked, and later, currents, sediments, and human activity have complicated the record. The mystery is not whether sea levels changed. They did. The harder question is how the connection happened, and how it felt to those living near the basin. A lesser-known part of this story is that the Bosporus is not simply a clean canal carved between two seas. It is a narrow, twisting strait with deep channels, sills, steep margins, and a modern two-layer flow less salty. Black Sea water moving outward near the surface. Denser Mediterranean water moving inward below. That layered exchange belongs to the present system, but it hints at how physically complex the meeting of waters can be. When bodies of water differ in level, salinity, and density, their connection is not just a line filling in, it is a struggle of currents, chemistry, erosion, and gravity. If the threshold broke suddenly, the first changes may have appeared far from the main inflow as a rising level along the old Black Sea shore. The water would not need to announce its source. A community at the northern edge of the basin might only see that the lake no longer obeys familiar limits. Flats remained flooded after storm should have passed. River mouths back up. Freshwater marshes become deeper. The old shoreline loses its reliability. Perhaps dead trees stand in water where dry ground had been. Perhaps fish change. Perhaps the taste of water in certain places shifts. No one there needs to see the Bosporus to understand that something has gone wrong. Nearer the southwest, the transformation may have been more direct. The land around the threshold would have heard and felt the change if the inflow was violent enough. Erosion can turn a spillover into a channel, and a channel into a more permanent passage. The first cut matters because moving water deepens its own road. Once a flow begins, it may enlarge the opening that feeds it. This is how thresholds fail in many landscapes, not always in one clean collapse, but through feedback, with water making itself stronger by cutting the path wider or deeper. No single explanation fully accounts for every clue in the Black Sea case, but this principle gives the proposed flood its terrifying logic. Still, the most responsible version of the story keeps wonder and caution together. It is possible that later storytelling has made the flood sharper than the geology allows. It is possible that some researchers have overestimated the drop between the outer sea and the old basin. It is also possible that people living at the time experienced a rapid environmental disaster, even if it was not as cinematic as the most famous version suggests. Human catastrophe does not require the maximum geological model. If water rises fast enough to erase shoreland within memory, if it destroys camps, forces movement, changes food sources, and makes old knowledge unreliable, then it is already a world-ending event for the communities caught in it. The breaking of the threshold, whether abrupt or staged, marks a change in identity. The lower basin becomes more closely tied to the Mediterranean system. Saltwater enters, levels shift, ecology begins to transform. A world shaped by river inflow and local balance starts becoming the sea known from later history. This is one of the deep patterns of the post-Ice Age Earth places that seem separate are suddenly revealed to be connected. An ice sheet melts far away. The global ocean rises. A narrow sill is crossed and a shoreline hundreds of kilometers distant is doomed. For the people along the old margins, there may have been no grand understanding of this chain. There is only the evidence of the senses water too high, ground too wet, paths cut off, familiar markers gone. The threshold does not need a name to change their lives. It only needs to fail. And as the outside sea finds its way into the basin, the quiet, low world described by rivers, reeds, camps, and remembered shores begins to enter its final form. The door has opened. Behind it is not one wave. Not yet the full human reckoning, but the beginning of a new geography, as water from beyond the horizon starts remaking the edge of history itself. If the Bosporus threshold truly failed with force, the flood would not have behaved like an ordinary river swelling after rain. It would have been a transfer between unequal worlds, a body of water higher and heavier finding a lower basin and pouring into it day after day, perhaps year after year, until the old balance was broken beyond repair. The famous image is a moving wall of water, and that image may be too simple, perhaps even too dramatic in its sharpness. Yet something about it catches the deeper truth. A flood of this kind is not only water passing over land, it is geography in motion. Near the breach, the sound would have been the first impossible thing, not the crash of a single wave, but a continuous roar, a force that does not spend itself and fall silent. Water falling through a narrow passage can become a living engine. It tears at banks, lifts stones, drags sediment into suspension, and turns the air wet with spray. If the difference in water level was large, then the inflow may have cut down into the threshold, deepening its own channel as it moved. In that case, the flood would have grown more effective as it continued. the passage becoming not a temporary wound but a permanent artery between seas. The scale is difficult to imagine because humans are used to floods that rise, peak, and retreat. This one, in the catastrophic model, would not retreat. It would make a new shoreline and then keep moving inland. The old shore of the Black Sea basin would become a temporary line, then a drowned line, then a forgotten one. Low flats would vanish first. Marshes would deepen. River mouths would back up. Water would enter side valleys and turn them into long fingers of drowned land. A place that had once been crossed on foot might become a difficult wetland, then an inlet, then open water. The disaster would spread outward from the basin's edge not as a single strike, but as an expanding condition. Scholars still debate how fast this happened. Some early versions of the Black Sea flood hypothesis imagined an astonishing daily rise, with water advancing across the low margins at a speed that could force communities to flee repeatedly. Other studies have suggested a slower reconnection, a smaller level difference, or a more complex sequence of changes. The evidence remains incomplete, and the most extreme numbers should be treated with caution. But even a slower rise can be devastating when it continues beyond the memory of normal seasonal change. A shoreline that moves hundreds of meters or more across low ground in a human lifetime can destroy the logic of a home. For people near the water, speed would be measured not in scientific units but in losses. One season, a fishing camp stands safely above the reeds. Another season, the reeds surround it. Later, the same place is reached only by boat or not at all. Stored food must be moved. Tools are gathered in haste or abandoned. Fires are rebuilt farther inland. A child may hear adults speak of where the old shore used to be, but the child sees only water. This is how catastrophe becomes memory. Not always through one spectacular day, but through repeated proof that the past has become physically unreachable. There is also the question of salt. If Mediterranean water entered a lower, fresher Black Sea basin, the flood was not merely raising the surface, it was changing the character of the water. Saltwater intrusion could alter fish populations, wetlands, shellfish, plants, and drinking sources along affected areas. The modern Black Sea is famous for its unusual water structure, with oxygenated upper layers and deeper waters that are largely anoxic, hostile to most familiar forms of life. That later condition is not simply the flood itself, but the mixing of waters, salinity, and basin shape made the Black Sea a chemically strange place over time. A lesser-known detail is that such low oxygen depths can preserve organic material unusually well, meaning the sea that drowned older landscapes may also have helped protect traces that would have rotted away elsewhere. At the human scale, however, chemistry would first appear as confusion. Fish that once gathered in known places might shift. Reeds might die back in some zones and flourish in others. Water that had been useful could become suspect. Freshwater streams entering the basin might remain important refuges, drawing people and animals to narrower points of survival. What had been a broad, generous margin could become a broken edge where good water, dry land, and safe passage were harder to find together. No single explanation fully accounts for every clue, but the environmental stress implied by a major shift is not difficult to understand. The flood would also have altered sound, smell, and distance. A larger body of water changes winds. It changes fog. It changes the flight paths of birds and the movement of animals around its edge. It makes far shores more distant, familiar landmarks lower against the horizon, or gone entirely. Wet ground smells different when it becomes a permanent inlet. Dead vegetation caught under rising water releases its own heavy breath. Trees drowned at their roots can stand for a time like grey markers of retreat, then fall and drift. Such details rarely survive in sediment cores, but they are the texture of disaster for those who live through it. It is important not to turn this into a scene of helpless panic alone. People are not passive objects before water. They watch, learn, move, rebuild, and adapt. Some may have left early, following animals or kinship ties inland. Some may have shifted to higher terraces and continued using the new shoreline. Some may have turned the flood's edge into opportunity, fishing in newly formed inlets or moving along water routes that had not existed before. Human resilience is part of the story. But resilience does not erase loss. Adaptation is often what people do after the world has already taken something from them. The idea of a moving wall, then, should be understood broadly. It may not have been a vertical wall racing across the entire basin. It may have been a wall of inevitability, water entering through a threshold, rising beyond familiar limits, and pushing the human world backward until old places disappeared under a surface that would not open again. Whether the flood was brutally sudden or unfolded through a complex sequence, its power lies in the transformation from land to memory. The shore that once held fires, tracks, plants, and graves became seafloor. The line on the land moved, and with it moved the boundary between a world people could touch and a world that would survive only in fragments, stories, and mud. The water's greatest violence may not have been the force at the Bosporus, but the quiet work it performed far from the breach, where ordinary human places began to lose their meaning. A flood becomes history when it touches settlement. Before that, it is geology, climate, pressure, erosion, a change in basin level. But once it reaches the places where people sleep, cook, mend tools, bury their dead, teach children paths, and return after long journeys, it becomes something more intimate. It becomes the breaking of a map carried in the body. Along the old Black Sea margins, villages and camps would not necessarily have looked like later towns. There may have been no stone streets, no walls, no temples rising over the shore. Some places may have been seasonal stopping points, used when fish ran thick or birds arrived in the marshes. Others may have been more lasting, especially as people in the wider region experimented with storage, cultivation, and more settled rhythms of life. What survives in the record suggests that the boundary between mobile and settled life was not absolute. A community might move through part of the year and still hold deep attachment to a favoured shore. A place does not need to be permanent in the modern sense to be remembered as home. The first losses would be practical. A hearth too close to the water becomes useless. A storage pit floods and spoils what had been saved against hunger. A low shelter must be taken apart or left behind. Nets, baskets, digging sticks, bone tools, and grinding stones must be carried uphill if there is time, but not everything can be moved. Heavy stones chosen for grinding grain or plant foods may stay where they are. Stakes driven into wet ground for fish traps may disappear beneath deeper water. Paths connecting shore, marsh, and higher ground become mud, then channels. A person who once walked straight to a fishing place must take a longer way around, and then, later, cannot reach it at all. Yet the hardest losses are not always useful things. They are places made sacred by repetition. A tree where elders rested, a rise of ground where the first spring birds were watched, a bend in the river known for good fish, a burial placed carefully in dry earth with objects, food, ochre, beads, or tools, depending on the traditions of the community. The evidence remains incomplete for the specific drowned settlements of the Black Sea margins, but across prehistory, burial and memory are often tied strongly to landscape. To lose ground is sometimes to lose ancestors in the most literal sense. The dead remain where they were placed, but the living are forced away. This is one reason floods live so long in human imagination. Fire can destroy a house, but the ground beneath remains. War can scatter a community, but survivors may return to ruins. Water denies return differently. It covers, it smooths, it turns a place into surface. A person may know exactly where something lies and still be unable to touch it. For a community without writing, without surveyed maps, without monuments built to resist centuries, such a loss can feel like the world has swallowed proof of itself. Later generations may inherit only the shape of the story. There was land there, and then the water came. The rising basin would also have forced choices between speed and attachment. Some communities may have retreated gradually, moving camps upslope as the shoreline advanced. Others may have resisted leaving until repeated flooding made staying impossible. Human beings often cling to threatened places because they are not only calculating danger, they are defending familiarity. A higher terrace may be safer, but the old shore has food, knowledge, and memory. Even today, people rebuild in floodplains and on storm-battered coasts because land is never just land. For prehistoric communities with fewer material buffers, the decision could be harsher. Move too late, and food stores vanish. Move too soon, and a community abandons a place that might still sustain it. The flood may have changed social life as much as geography. Families or small groups pushed from low shores would need to negotiate access to higher ground already known or used by others. New arrivals bring skills, stories, tools, and perhaps tension. If fishing grounds shrink or freshwater sources become more valuable, conflict becomes possible. Though direct evidence is difficult to prove, cooperation is just as likely in many circumstances. Marriage ties, exchange networks, shared seasonal gatherings, a mutual knowledge could help people absorb displacement. Scholars still debate how far the flood may have driven migration, but any serious shoreline loss would have rearranged relationships between groups. Children living through such a time would inherit a divided world. Adults could remember places that no longer existed above water. Children could not. For them, the new shoreline would become normal. They might hear that people once walked across what is now an inlet, or that fires once burned where waves now break, or that an ancestor lies beneath the dark water. Such memories can become practical warnings, sacred stories, or fragments of explanation. The original event may become compressed, reshaped, and carried forward not as a geological report but as an image. A world drowned because water crossed a boundary it had never crossed before. A lesser-known consequence of drowned landscapes is the disappearance of evidence for ordinary lives. Archaeology often favours what survives on dry land stone tools, pottery, bones, hearths, foundations, charred seeds, post holes. But coastal and lakeside communities often use materials that decay quickly: wood, fibre, reeds, leather, baskets, cordage, nets, and plant remains. Under the right underwater conditions, some of these can survive astonishingly well, but they are hard to find and harder to interpret across large submerged areas. The sea may be both destroyer and keeper. It erases access while preserving certain traces in darkness. This makes the people of the drowned shore feel close and distant at once. For those who fled or adapted, The flood did not end when the water stopped rising. It continued in the changed habits of daily life. New camps had to be established, new paths learned, new fish caught, new fields or gathering grounds found, new agreements made with neighbours, new stories told to explain why the old ones no longer matched the land. A community may survive and still be altered at its core. Survival does not mean continuity without scars. Beneath the modern waterline, then, the most important ruins may be invisible not because they were grand, but because they were human in the simplest way. A hearth, a tool-making floor, a line of stakes, a patch of trampled earth, a burial, a path to reeds. These are the kinds of places the flood would have taken first, long before history could name them. And if the Black Sea flood changed human history, it did so not only by enlarging a body of water, but by forcing living communities to discover that even home can become part of the deep. The drowned shore does not speak in one clear voice. It speaks through fragments lifted from darkness, a shell from the wrong kind of water, a layer of mud where the chemistry shifts, an ancient channel traced across the seafloor, a buried beach lying far below the modern waves. None of these clues is dramatic by itself. A sediment core is not a ruined city. A mollusk shell does not look like the turning point of human history. Yet this is often how deep history survives, not as a single revelation, but as many small witnesses that must be placed beside one another until a vanished landscape begins to return. The Black Sea is difficult to investigate because it hides its past under a powerful combination of depth, sediment, and unusual water chemistry. Its lower waters are famously poor in oxygen, and in the deep basin, organic decay works differently than it does in open, well-mixed seas. This has helped preserve some materials in remarkable ways, including ancient wooden shipwrecks from later historical periods, but it also means the seafloor is not a simple open page. Layers accumulate. Slopes collapse. Currents disturb. Later human history settles on top of older prehistory. The evidence remains incomplete, and every clue must be handled carefully because underwater landscapes can deceive as easily as they reveal. One of the most important kinds of evidence is the submerged shoreline. If the old Black Sea basin once stood much lower, then it should have left traces at that former level beach ridges, wave-cut terraces, deltas, and nearshore sediments formed when water met land. Researchers look for these marks the way a tracker looks for footprints after rain. A beach is not only sand, it is an energy zone, shaped by waves, shells, minerals, and sorted grains. A river entering a lake or sea leaves its own fan of sediment. If such features appear below the present waterline, they can suggest where the old edge once lay. But interpreting them is complicated. Shorelines can be reworked, sediments can slide. Later water movement can blur the original pattern. What survives in the record suggests former water levels, but the exact timing and meaning of each trace remain debated. Shells have become another famous clue. Different mollusks prefer different water conditions. Some live in freshwater or brackish environments, others belong to saltier marine settings. When scientists find layers where one group of shells gives way to another, they may be seeing an ecological change written in calcium carbonate in the Black Sea story. The appearance of Mediterranean-type marine species above earlier freshwater or brackish forms has been used to argue for a major change in connection and salinity. It is a small detail with enormous implications, tiny animals marking the arrival of a different sea. Yet even here, caution matters. Shells can be transported, reworked, or dated with uncertainties. Scholars still debate the timing and speed of the transition, because shells tell part of the story, not all of it. Sediment cores offer a deeper record. A tube driven into the seafloor can bring up a vertical history of mud, sand, organic matter, shells, pollen, and chemical traces. Layer by layer, it preserves changes in erosion, salinity, oxygen, and biological life. A sudden deposit of coarser material may suggest energetic water movement. A shift in microfossils can point to changing conditions. Pollen may hint at vegetation around the basin, showing whether nearby land held steppe, forest, marsh, or cultivated plants. These cores are quiet things, but they allow scientists to read time downward. Near the top is the more recent sea. Lower down lie older conditions. Somewhere in between may be the signature of transformation. There are also river channels drowned beneath the water, on exposed ice age shelves around the world. Rivers once flowed across ground that is now seabed, cutting valleys toward lower shorelines. In the Black Sea basin, submerged channels and deltic features can help reconstruct how rivers reach the old water body before the modern level formed. They are reminders that the seafloor was once not a floor at all, but a surface with slopes, streams, banks, and roots. A river valley underwater can be one of the most vivid proofs of a lost world, because rivers do not carve their paths through open sea, they carve through land. The most tempting evidence, of course, is archaeological. The idea of villages beneath the Black Sea has captured the public imagination because it promises a direct human face to the flood. Expeditions have searched submerged zones for signs of habitation, worked wood, stone features, tools, possible structures, or traces of human use along ancient shorelines. Some intriguing finds have been reported over the years. An underwater archaeology in the region has revealed extraordinary preservation for later periods. But prehistoric settlement evidence remains difficult to confirm at the scale the story invites. A shape on the seafloor may be natural. A piece of wood may be old without proving a village. A cluster of stones may be suggestive but not decisive. No single explanation fully accounts for every claim. And the strongest arguments depend on combining archaeology with geology, rather than leaning on one spectacular object. A lesser-known difficulty is that the best places for human settlement are not always the easiest places to preserve or find. Low-shore camps can be eroded by the very water that drowns them. Organic materials decay unless conditions become favourable quickly. Thin occupation layers may be buried under meters of mud, fishing traps, reed structures, and light shelters leave subtle traces compared with stone architecture. If early communities along the old basin were partly mobile or used perishable materials, their archaeological footprint could be faint even before the flood. Underwater, it becomes fainter still. And yet the absence of grand ruins should not be mistaken for absence of people. The seafloor evidence points to changing water levels, shifting environments, and drowned margins. Human groups in the wider region certainly existed during the relevant periods. The question is not whether people lived in the broad world around the basin, but how many lived on the exact lands later submerged, how they used those lands, and how directly the flood affected them. Here the evidence narrows and becomes uncertain. What can be inferred must not be overstated. Still, the inference itself is reasonable. Productive shorelines attract human life, and drowned shorelines may hide the traces of that life. The Black Sea, then, becomes both witness and vault. It preserves enough to suggest that a major transformation occurred, but not enough to settle every argument. Its mud contains changes in water, life, and landscape. Its submerged forms mark older edges. Its shells remember salinity. Its buried channels remember rivers. Its darkness may still hold traces of people whose world was taken by rising water. The mystery survives not because there is no evidence, but because the evidence is partial, technical, and hauntingly indirect. The flood is not written in one inscription. It is scattered across the seafloor, waiting to be read through mud, shell, current, and silence. The deeper the evidence goes, the less simple the story becomes. At first, the Black Sea flood seems to offer the kind of ancient disaster that explains itself in one image: a lower basin, a rising Mediterranean, a broken threshold, and water roaring into a world that had no defense against it. It is powerful because it feels complete. It gives geology a plot and prehistory a wound. Yet the seafloor does not surrender so easily. Every shell, every sediment layer, every submerged ridge has to be interpreted, and interpretation is where the flood becomes not only a catastrophe, but a debate. One side of the debate imagines a dramatic reconnection. In this view, the Black Sea basin stands far below the level of the Mediterranean system, perhaps as a large lake with shorelines well beneath the modern sea. Then the outside water rises high enough to cross or cut through the Bosporus threshold. Once the passage opens, gravity does the rest. Salt water pours northward, the basin level climbs, and low-lying shores are rapidly swallowed. The attraction of this model is obvious. It explains a sudden ecological shift, a drowned landscape, and perhaps the deep roots of later flood memories. It also fits a broader truth of the post-Ice Age world. Rising seas repeatedly erased human ground. But another side argues that the transformation may have been slower, less violent, and more complicated than the famous catastrophic version suggests. According to this view, the water levels may not have differed as dramatically. The Black Sea may have already been closer to the level of the outside sea, or there may have been earlier connections and exchanges that softened the later event. Instead of one overwhelming breach, there may have been a sequence of changes, gradual rise, intermittent flow, shifting salinity, river-fed expansion, and eventual establishment of the modern connection. In such a model, the flood is still real in the broad sense of landscape loss, but it is not necessarily a single roaring moment that changes everything overnight. The disagreement is not simply a matter of cautious scholars trying to drain drama from a good story. It comes from the difficulty of reading a landscape that has been drowned, buried, and altered for thousands of years. Radiocarbon dates can be affected by old carbon in aquatic systems. Shells may not date the exact moment they seem to represent. Sediment layers can be disturbed or redeposited. A shoreline feature may appear clear in one survey and ambiguous in another. The Bosporus itself is a dynamic passage, and later currents have had millennia to reshape parts of the evidence. The evidence remains incomplete not because researchers have looked carelessly, but because the archive itself is damaged. This is one of the surprising lessons of ancient catastrophes. The larger the event, the more tempting it is to simplify it, yet the traces often become more confusing with scale. A local flood may leave debris against a wall, silt inside a house, and objects dropped in panic. A basin-wide transformation leaves chemical shifts, shoreline features, biological changes, and patterns spread across huge distances. Each clue may point to water, but not always to the same speed. Cause, or human meaning. No single explanation fully accounts for every clue, which is why the Black Sea flood remains alive as a scientific argument rather than closed as a settled tale. For the catastrophic model, one important strength is the logic of threshold failure. Around the world, basins can change quickly when barriers break. Lakes trapped behind ice, landslides, volcanic deposits, or natural sills can drain or fill with breathtaking speed when water finds a route through. Once erosion begins, flow can deepen the breach and increase its own power. This is not fantasy. The geological record contains many examples of sudden water release and rapid landscape change. So the idea that a narrow threshold could produce a major flood is physically reasonable. The question is whether the Black Sea conditions at that time were exactly right for such a dramatic event. For the gradual model, one important strength is the recognition that coastlines often drown through long processes that still feel catastrophic to humans. Sea level rise after the Ice Age was not smooth, but neither was every shoreline loss a single instant. A lower basin can rise through river inflow, marine water can enter in stages, salinity can change gradually enough for ecosystems to adjust unevenly. Human communities might retreat repeatedly over generations rather than flee once from a wall of water. This version may seem less cinematic, but it may better match some interpretations of seafloor data. It also respects the fact that human disaster can be slow and still total. Between these positions are many possible middle paths. Perhaps there was a rapid marine incursion, but not as extreme as the boldest version. Perhaps there were earlier, smaller connections followed by a stronger later one. Perhaps different parts of the basin experienced the change differently, with some low shores drowned quickly while higher or steeper margins changed more slowly. Perhaps local storms, river floods, and rising basin levels combined into a disaster that no single mechanism can explain alone. Scholars still debate these possibilities because the Black Sea was not one uniform bathtub. It was a vast, irregular basin with rivers, shelves, slopes, deltas, marshes, and human lives distributed unevenly around its edge. The debate also reveals something about modern hunger for origins. People want to know whether this was the flood behind later myths, whether drowned villages sent memories into Mesopotamia, whether the story of a world-ending deluge began with this one event. That desire can distort the evidence. A powerful myth does not need one perfect source. Many real floods, across many river valleys and coasts, may have shaped ancient memory. The Black Sea event may have been one of them. But treating it as the single origin of all flood stories goes beyond what the evidence can safely bear. The responsible mystery is more interesting than the unsupported certainty. It allows the flood to be large without making it carry every legend ever told. What survives in the record suggests a major environmental transformation in the Black Sea region after the Ice Age, but the tempo remains uncertain. That uncertainty should not flatten the story, it should sharpen it. The people who lived through the change did not know the model either. They did not know whether future researchers would call it sudden or gradual. They knew only that water was remaking the world at the scale of the lived experience. For them, a debate over meters, dates, and flow rates would have meant little beside the disappearance of paths, camps, fields, marshes, and graves. So the flood remains suspended between two kinds of truth. Scientifically, it is a problem of evidence, method, and careful restraint. Humanly, it is a story of ground lost to water. The seafloor keeps its arguments in layers of mud and shell, and researchers keep returning to them because the answer matters. Not only for the Black Sea, but for the wider question of how often human history has been shaped by places that vanished before writing could remember them. Whether the water came as a roar or a relentless rise, it left behind a mystery deep enough that even now, beneath the waves, the old shoreline is still being argued into view. Long after the old shores of the Black Sea sink beneath the surface, water continues to move through human memory. It changes form there. It loses exact dates, distances, and sediment layers. It becomes a story told beside fires, in houses of reed and mud brick, in fields that depend on rivers, in cities where scribes eventually press signs into wet clay. By the time flood stories appear in written form, the people who first watched post-Ice Age waters rise are gone beyond naming. The landscapes they knew are already transformed, but the fear remains recognizable. The world can be covered, the ground can fail, water can cross the boundary that keeps life possible. The ancient Near East becomes one of the great homes of flood memory. In Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates spread through low plains, channels, marshes, and shifting river courses, floods are not remote possibilities. They are part of life, sometimes life-giving, sometimes ruinous. Rivers bring silt, fertility, fish, reeds, and transport. They also break banks, drown fields, undermine houses, spread disease, and erase boundaries that humans carefully mark. It is not surprising that people living in such a world imagine water as both blessing and judgment, both creation and destruction. The river valley itself teaches that civilization stands on wet and unstable ground. Some of the most famous ancient flood traditions come from Mesopotamian literature, including stories preserved in Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Babylonian forms. These tales speak of a great flood sent by divine powers, a chosen survivor, a vessel, animals, birds released over water, and the re-establishment of life after destruction. Their details vary across texts and periods, and they belong to religious and literary worlds very different from geology. It would be careless to treat them as direct reports of the Black Sea flood. They were shaped by theology, kingship, ritual, memory, local river disasters, and the storytelling needs of societies that had already lived with floods for millennia. Scholars still debate how far any single environmental event lies behind them, and the evidence remains incomplete. Yet dismissing them as pure invention would be just as shallow. Myths often carry environmental memory, not as precise documentation, but as compressed experience. A river flood, a storm surge, a drowned plane, a sudden lake outburst, a shoreline lost over generations, any of these can become part of a culture's store of remembered danger. Over time, separate floods may merge into one archetypal flood. Local disasters may be enlarged to cosmic scale. Practical warnings may become sacred stories. Memory does not preserve events like a sediment core. It preserves meaning. In flood myths, the meaning is clear. The human world is fragile because water remembers no human border. This is where the Black Sea flood becomes tempting. If communities were displaced from drowned margins and moved through regions connected by rivers and trade, perhaps stories of a great water rising entered wider oral traditions. Perhaps memories of the lost shores travelled south or east, changing as people encountered new landscapes and new disasters. Perhaps a real post-Ice Age transformation became one thread among many in the tapestry of Near Eastern flood mythology. This is possible, but it remains an inference. No inscription says that a storyteller in Mesopotamia was remembering the Black Sea basin. No ancient text gives a usable map back to the Bosporus. The responsible position is to see the connection as intriguing, not proven. A lesser-known detail is that flood stories are not confined to one place. They appear in many cultures across the world, often in regions where rivers, coasts, monsoons, tsunamis, or glacial lakes created powerful experiences of water. This wide distribution does not mean all traditions come from one original megaflood. It more likely shows that floods are among the most common and psychologically overwhelming catastrophes humans face. Water destroys in a way that feels total. It covers evidence. It surrounds survivors. It turns familiar land into an alien surface. It separates the before from the after with unusual clarity. That makes it ideal material for myth, ritual, and warning. The Mesopotamian case, however, is especially important because it sits near the birth of written history. There, oral traditions eventually pass into tablets. Stories that may have circulated for centuries or longer become fixed, copied, edited, and carried into later cultures. The written flood narrative is therefore not the beginning of the memory, but a late surviving form of it. What survives in the record suggests that by the time scribes write these stories down, the flood has already become more than an event. It is a moral and cosmic structure. It explains destruction, survival, divine anger, human vulnerability, and the renewal of order. This transformation from event to meaning may be the most important legacy of ancient floods. A real flood leaves mud. A remembered flood leaves a lesson. In early societies, that lesson can shape how people think about gods, kings, cities, and the duties of survival. If the waters once rose and took everything, then storing grain matters, building on high ground matters, reading omens matters, honouring the forces that govern river and storm matters. Myths do not need to be literal to influence real decisions. They can teach caution, justify rituals, and remind communities that prosperity is never entirely secure. There is also a human tenderness hidden inside these stories. Behind the grand scale of divine floods and world destruction is a smaller image, someone trying to save life from water, seeds, animals, tools, family, memory, whether in myth or in real disaster. Survival begins with choosing what can be carried. The communities around the old Black Sea margins, if forced from their shore, would have faced the same ancient calculation. What can be saved when the place itself cannot be saved? A basket of grain, a child, a stone tool, an animal, a story? Civilization later turned such acts into epic narrative, but the root is painfully ordinary. So the flood stories of the ancient world should be approached like reflections on disturbed water. They may show real shapes, but not with clean edges. The Black Sea flood may be one of the events that helped deepen humanity's long memory of drowning lands. It may have contributed to a wider pattern of stories born from rivers, coasts, storms, and rising seas. Or it may stand beside them as a separate disaster, whose direct memory vanished before writing could catch it. No single explanation fully accounts for the persistence of flood myths, because they grow from both landscape and imagination. Still, when ancient texts speak of waters overwhelming the human world, they do not feel abstract. They feel rooted in the oldest fear of settled life, that the ground beneath the village, the field, the grave, and the path may not endure. The Black Sea's drowned shore gives that fear a geological body. The myths give it a human voice. Between them lies the long passage from mud to memory, where a real landscape lost beneath water becomes, perhaps, part of the oldest story humanity keeps telling itself. When water takes land, it rarely takes only land. It moves people, and people carry more than their belongings. They carry techniques, seeds, animals, memories, fears, songs, burial habits, tool styles, and the quiet assumptions of one landscape into another. A flood can therefore continue travelling long after the water itself has reached its new level. It travels in displaced families, in marriages between groups that once lived apart, in new paths opened by necessity, in old skills made valuable in unfamiliar country. If the Black Sea margins were drowned, whether suddenly or through a relentless rise, the human consequences would not have stopped at the new shoreline. They would have walked inland. Migration from drowned lands is difficult to prove in the direct way people often want. No trail of footprints leads from the old submerged shore to a clearly marked new village with a sign announcing where its people came from. Archaeology rarely offers such clean evidence, especially for communities living before writing. Pottery styles may shift, tools may appear in new areas, genetic signals may hint at movement across generations, but each clue can have more than one explanation. Trade can spread objects without mass migration. Shared needs can produce similar tools in different places. People can move slowly, merge with others, or leave almost no distinct signature. Scholars still debate the scale of movement connected to the Black Sea flood, and the evidence remains incomplete. Still, the logic of displacement is hard to ignore. Productive lowlands attract people, and when those lowlands vanish, the people who relied on them must adjust. Some may move only a short distance, retreating upslope and continuing to live beside the new waterline. Others may follow river valleys away from the basin, seeking fresh water, familiar plants, fish, game, and kin. Rivers are natural routes of retreat because they are already known corridors. A group displaced from a shore does not step into a blank world. It chooses paths shaped by water, animals, terrain, and earlier relationships. In this sense, the same rivers that once fed the Black Sea basin may have carried people away from it. The movement would not have looked like a single exodus. It would have been uneven, layered, and humanly complicated. One household leaves after a bad flood season. Another waits until salt changes the marsh. A third splits, with some members staying near the new shore and others joining relatives inland. A young person marries into a community beyond the basin and takes stories of the drowned land there. A skilled fisher finds opportunity along another river. A family that once depended on wetland resources learns to farm more heavily, or to herd, or to combine old and new ways. No single explanation fully accounts for how displaced communities behave, because survival is made of many small decisions rather than one grand movement. In the wider region, this was already a time of profound human change. Farming, herding, and more settled village life was spreading through parts of Anatolia, southeastern Europe, and the Near East over long periods. The Black Sea world sits near roots where ideas and people could move between these zones. If flood-driven movement occurred, it may have intersected with these broader transformations. People pushed from shorelands might have joined existing communities, carried knowledge of plants and animals, or helped create new settlements in safer places. It would be too much to say that the flood alone spread farming into Europe. That would oversimplify a vast and debated process. But environmental pressure could have added force to movements already underway. A lesser-known detail about prehistoric migration is that it often works through contact zones, not empty frontiers. When people arrive in a new region, they meet others who already know the land. The result may be exchange, conflict, alliance, intermarriage, imitation, or avoidance. A displaced group may bring useful knowledge, but it also needs local knowledge to survive. Which plants can be eaten here? Where does snow linger? Which stream dries in summer? Which stone is good for blades? Which neighbouring group is friendly? And which path should be avoided? Migration is therefore not just movement across space. It is negotiation with a living human landscape. If the drowned Black Sea margins sent people outward, their stories may have changed quickly. The first generation remembers exact places the marsh where birds nested, the old bend in the river, the shore where a burial lay, the path that now ends in water. The second generation remembers the loss more than the details. The third generation may inherit an origin story their people came from land taken by a rising sea. By the time such memories travel far, they become less like geography and more like identity. They explain why a group moved, why certain rituals matter, why water is feared, why ancestors are imagined beneath a surface that cannot be crossed. Movement also reshapes technology. People forced into new environments often adapt old tools to new conditions. Fishing gear may be modified for different rivers. Boats or dugouts, if used, may become more or less important depending on the new landscape. Grinding stones may reflect greater reliance on plant foods. Storage pits and containers may become more valuable if communities settle longer in one place. The flood itself may not create these changes from nothing, but it can intensify them by making old routines unreliable. A disaster often accelerates choices that might otherwise unfold slowly. There is another possibility. Quieter but equally important, some people may not have moved far at all. They may have stayed with the water. As the basin rose, new bays, inlets, and shorelines formed. Fish populations changed, but fishing did not end. Wetlands shifted, but new wetlands appeared. The people most skilled at reading water may have found ways to live along the transformed edge. In this sense, the flood both displaced and created. It destroyed one shore while making another. It forced memory to detach from old landmarks, but it also gave future generations a new sea to navigate. This dual nature complicates the idea of catastrophe. The drowned land is a loss, but the new Black Sea becomes part of later human history, a route for trade, migration, myth, and empire. What is disaster for one generation becomes geography for another. Children born after the flood do not see an invading sea. They see the world. They learn its winds, currents, fish, storms, and shore paths as if it had always been that way. Human beings are extraordinarily good at normalizing the aftermath of upheaval. That talent is a form of survival, but it also hides the depth of what was lost. So migration from the drowned margins may have changed history not through one dramatic march, but through diffusion, people spreading along rivers, joining other groups, carrying stories, skills, fears, and habits into new places. The flood's human force would have been carried in bodies and memories. It would have entered marriage networks, settlement choices, farming experiments, and myths of origin. The water may have stopped at its new shore, but the people did not. They moved, adapted, remembered, and forgot. And in that long human movement, the drowned Black Sea world may have flowed outward into the wider story of Europe, Anatolia, and the ancient Near East, not as a single visible wave, but as 1,000 footsteps leaving a shore that could no longer be reached. The flood belongs to water, but it also belongs to food. By the time the Black Sea margins are changing, human communities across the wider region are already experimenting with one of the most consequential shifts in history, the move toward farming, herding, storage, and more settled life. This transformation does not happen everywhere at once. and it does not arrive like a sudden invention. It grows unevenly from older ways of living, from gathering wild grains, managing useful plants, hunting animals that later become domestic herds, returning to rich places season after season, and learning that some landscapes can be shaped as well as used. The flood does not create agriculture by itself. That would be too simple. But catastrophe can put pressure on a world already changing, and pressure can make slow transformations suddenly matter. For tens of thousands of years, human beings survive by knowing movement. They follow seasons, animals, ripening plants, water sources, and stone. Mobility is not a primitive lack of settlement. It is a sophisticated strategy. It allows people to spread risk across landscapes. If one valley fails, another may provide. If animals move, people move with them. If drought strikes one place, memory offers routes elsewhere. But as some communities begin to rely more heavily on stored food, tended plants, managed animals, and built dwellings, their relationship with land becomes deeper and more dangerous. Staying gives rewards. It also creates exposure. A flood that destroys a temporary camp is a loss. A flood that destroys stored grain, fields, animal enclosures, tools, houses, and graves can threaten the entire structure of life. The end of the Ice Age creates opportunities for this shift. Warmer conditions allow new plant communities to spread. Wild cereals become important in parts of the Near East. Herd animals gather in patterns that people can observe and eventually manipulate. More predictable seasonal abundance in some regions encourages longer stays. Storage becomes more useful when food can be gathered or harvested in quantity. Storage, in turn, changes social life. It creates planning, ownership, defense, obligation, and inequality in small beginnings. What survives in the record suggests that the path toward farming is not a straight road, but a web of experiments, some successful, some abandoned, some repeated under different conditions. A flood can strike directly at these experiments if people are beginning to cultivate or tend plants near a low shoreline. Rising water can ruin the ground they have learned to work. If they keep animals near wetlands or river mouths, salinity changes and expanding marshes can alter grazing. If they store food in pits or baskets, dampness can spoil what would have carried them through hunger. If they depend on predictable seasonal fish or bird migrations, changes in water depth and ecology can disrupt timing. The flood becomes not only an event of displacement, but a test of new life ways. It asks whether people tied more closely to place can adapt when place itself becomes unstable. This may be one of the hidden ways catastrophe shapes history. It does not always invent something new. It selects among existing possibilities. A community already familiar with plant foods may lean harder into cultivation after losing fishing grounds. A group with access to domestic animals may move more successfully into uplands than one dependent on wetlands alone. People carrying stored seeds from a drowned shore may plant them in new valleys. Others may abandon cultivation temporarily and return to more mobile strategies. No single explanation fully accounts for the spread of farming through this broad region, and scholars still debate the balance between migration, cultural exchange, local adoption, and environmental pressure. But it is reasonable to see flood and climate stress as part of the background force that made adaptability essential. The Black Sea region sits near a major zone of movement between Anatolia, southeastern Europe, the Caucasus, and the steppe. Ideas do not need armies or empires to travel through such places. They can move through marriage, exchange, seasonal meetings, shared grazing routes, river corridors, and displaced families. Farming knowledge may pass from one group to another gradually, with local changes at every step. A seed is not just a seed when it crosses a frontier. It carries a practice: when to plant, how to harvest, how to store, how to protect, how to cook, how to decide who owns the yield. An animal herd carries even more movement patterns: milk, meat, hides, dung, status, and new obligations. In a world disturbed by rising water, such knowledge could become especially valuable. A lesser-known detail is that early farming did not immediately make life easier. In many places, it brought harder labour, narrower diets, disease risks from closer living, and vulnerability to harvest failure. Foragers often ate a wider range of foods than early farmers. Settled villages could accumulate waste, attract pests, and spread infection. Yet farming also allowed food storage, population growth, stronger territorial claims, and the possibility of supporting larger communities. It was not simply progress, it was a trade. Catastrophe may have pushed some groups toward that trade not because it was obviously better, but because old forms of security had been weakened. The flood, then, belongs to a larger age of forced decisions. Imagine a community retreating from a drowned shore into a valley where others already live. Fish are less reliable. Old marsh plants are gone, but seeds can be planted on higher ground. Animals can be penned. Food can be stored beyond the reach of ordinary seasonal shortage. The first years may be difficult. There may be hunger, conflict, failed crops, and uncertainty. But children grow up learning the new pattern. They know the fields better than the lost shore. They inherit farming not as an experiment, but as the way people live. This is how world-changing transformations often happen, not through one person deciding to invent civilization, but through pressures that make certain habits more durable than others. Rising water removes old options. Climate shifts change animals and plants. Crowding near safer ground creates competition and cooperation. Storage becomes survival. Settlement becomes defense. Fields become memory. The same impulse that once tied people to a shoreline can tie them to cultivated earth. A village begins as a practical answer and becomes an ancestor place. Still, the older world does not disappear completely. Fishing continues, hunting continues, gathering continues. Early agricultural communities often depend on a mixed economy, combining crops, animals, wild foods, river resources, and exchange. This mixture is important because it shows that human adaptation is rarely pure. People do not leap from one age into another. They braid strategies together. The flood may have cut away certain strands and strengthened others, but it did not erase human flexibility. It forced people to rebuild life from what remained useful. So when farming meets catastrophe, the result is not a simple origin story. It is a tightening of the human bond with unstable ground. The very practices that make larger settlements possible also make environmental loss more dangerous. Fields cannot run. Stored grain cannot climb a hill by itself. Burials cannot retreat. Houses do not migrate as easily as tents. The flood reveals both the power and vulnerability of the new human world taking shape after the Ice Age. People learn to cultivate land, but land is changing under them. They learn to store food, but water can spoil it. They learn to settle, but the earth keeps reminding them that settlement is always a wager against time. The Black Sea is not alone in its drowned memory. Around the world, the end of the Ice Age leaves behind a pattern so widespread that it almost changes the meaning of prehistory itself. The map modern people inherit is a late map, drawn after the water has already risen. It shows seas where plains once stretched, channels where valleys once ran, islands where hills once stood, and coastlines that hide older human worlds beneath them. The Black Sea flood may be one of the most dramatic candidates for a sudden transformation, but it belongs to a larger age when the ocean returned, and with it came the slow disappearance of landscapes that may have shaped human life in ways archaeology is only beginning to recover. To the northwest of Europe, another lost world lies beneath the North Sea. It is often called Doggerland, though that name is modern and cannot capture the full lived reality of the place. During lower sea levels, this region connected Britain to continental Europe through a broad landscape of rivers, wetlands, lakes, woodlands, and open ground. Animals moved across it, people hunted, gathered, fished, and likely returned to favoured places across generations. It was not a narrow bridge in the simple sense, but a country of its own, with internal roots and resources. Today, fishing nets sometimes bring up bones, tools, and other traces from the seabed. Small reminders that beneath busy waters there was once land where people walked. Doggerland's disappearance was not one simple moment either. Rising seas gradually cut it apart, turning higher areas into islands and drowning lower plains. One especially dramatic event, the Storegga Slide tsunami, may have struck parts of the remaining landscape after a massive underwater landslide off Norway sent waves across the North Sea. The exact human impact remains debated, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the combination of long sea level rise and sudden marine disaster gives Doggerland a haunting similarity to the Black Sea story. In both cases, the question is not only what geology did, but what happened to the people whose world became water. Far to the south and east, the Persian Gulf may hide another major drowned landscape. During lower sea levels, much of the modern Gulf was exposed, and river systems from Mesopotamia and surrounding regions may have created a broad lowland with fresh water, marshes, and habitable corridors. Some researchers have suggested that this now submerged basin could have been an important refuge or passage for early human communities moving through Southwest Asia. Later, as the sea rose, the Gulf flooded, transforming land into a shallow sea connected to the Indian Ocean. The details remain debated, but the possibility is powerful. A region central to later civilization may have bordered, or even inherited memories from, lands now beneath the waves. The Persian Gulf case matters because it sits near the cradle of cities, agriculture, and written flood traditions. That does not prove a direct connection between a drowned Gulf landscape and any particular myth, just as the Black Sea cannot be made into the single source of all flood stories. But it reminds us that ancient Mesopotamia emerged beside unstable waters. Rivers shifted, marshes expanded and contracted, sea levels changed. People living there inherited not a fixed stage, but a dynamic lowland where land and water constantly negotiated with one another. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of civilization there, but environmental richness and environmental danger were both part of the bargain. Other drowned worlds are scattered across the edges of continents, along the Sunda Shelf of Southeast Asia. Lower Ice Age seas exposed enormous plains connecting parts of what are now islands. Rivers flowed across lands now submerged between Borneo, Sumatra, Java, and the Asian mainland in Sahul, the ancient continent that joined Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania at lower sea levels. Coastlines also shifted dramatically as waters rose, around Japan, the Mediterranean, the Red Sea. The Arabian coast, the Americas, and countless smaller shelves. The same broad pattern appears. The places humans may have used most intensely at the water's edge are often the places the ocean has hidden most thoroughly. A lesser-known truth is that the drowned coastal record may be one of the greatest missing archives in the story of human migration. For many years, archaeologists focused mainly on inland routes because those were the places where evidence could be found. But if early humans often followed coasts, rivers, estuaries, and marine resources, then many key sites now lie underwater. Coastal travel can be efficient. It offers fish, shellfish, birds, fresh water, and navigable edges. It can guide people across long distances without requiring them to cross harsh interiors. If such routes were important, then modern archaeology may be seeing only the surviving inland shadow of a much broader human journey. This changes how the Black Sea flood should be understood. It was not an isolated oddity, a strange local accident with no larger meaning. It was one expression of a planetary reorganization. The end of the Ice Age moved the borders of the habitable world. Some places became warmer and richer. Others became forested, marshy, or drowned. Human communities were not standing outside this transformation, observing it like later scientists. They were inside it. They were adapting in real time, sometimes gaining new opportunities and sometimes losing entire landscapes. The comparison with other drowned worlds also softens the temptation to make one flood explain too much. If flood myths, migrations, and settlement shifts appear in many places, they may not point back to a single catastrophe. They may point to an era when water was changing human geography almost everywhere. The Black Sea may have been especially memorable if its transformation was rapid. Doggerland may have vanished through a long drowning punctuated by catastrophe. The Persian Gulf may have become sea over generations. The Sunda Shelf may have seen enormous landscapes fragment into islands, different places, different tempos. One recurring lesson: the line between land and water is one of the most unstable boundaries in human history. For the people living through these changes, there was no global story. A family leaving a North Sea plain would not know of a rising Black Sea shore. A community near the Persian Gulf would not know of drowned forests in Southeast Asia. Yet they were all part of the same planetary aftermath. Ice melted, seas rose, thresholds failed, coasts retreated, human beings adjusted, remembered, and moved. Some losses became myth, some became silence, some lie in mud, waiting for sonar, cause, divers, and patient interpretation. The mega flood that changed human history forever may therefore be larger than one basin. The Black Sea is a powerful center for the story because it gives the mystery a threshold, a possible breach, a drowned shore, and a scientific debate. But beyond it spreads a whole world of submerged prehistory. The true flood is the post-Ice Age return of water across the planet, swallowing the edges where people lived, travelled, and learned to depend on place. Each drowned landscape is a missing chapter. Together, they suggest that human history did not simply unfold on the land we see today. Much of it began on shores that the sea has taken back. Civilization often begins where water is both generous and dangerous. This is one of the oldest contradictions in human history. The same rivers that feed fields can drown them. The same deltas that offer fish, reeds, mud, birds, and trade routes can shift channels without warning. The same coastlines that connect people across distance can open the door to storms, salt, erosion, and rising seas. After the Ice Age, as human communities grow more settled and more ambitious, they do not choose safe landscapes in any simple sense. They choose powerful landscapes, and power usually comes with risk. The great early centres of human life are rarely far from water. In Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates create a world of silt, irrigation, marshes, and unstable channels. In Egypt, the Nile turns desert margins into a long ribbon of fertility. Along the Indus, settlements rise beside rivers that nourish fields and later shift in ways that remain debated. In China, the Yellow River brings rich loess soil and devastating floods, earning a reputation in later memory as both mother and sorrow. Round lakes, coasts, wetlands, and deltas across the world, people discover the same bargain. Water gives abundance, but it never gives full control. This is why the Black Sea flood belongs to a larger human pattern. It is not only an episode of rising water in one basin, it is an early warning about the kind of ground on which complex societies often stand. Fertile margins invite people to settle, store, cultivate, and build. Once they do, they become more vulnerable to environmental change. A foraging group can move away from a failing shoreline with grief but relative speed. A village with fields, animals, graves, storage pits, paths, and social ties is more entangled. A city is more entangled still. The larger the human investment, the harder it becomes to retreat. The floodplain teaches organization. Seasonal waters must be watched. Fields must be timed. Canals must be cleared. Boundaries must be negotiated when river mud renews the land. Labour must be coordinated. Food must be stored. Disputes must be settled. In some regions, the need to manage water may have helped encourage stronger leadership, ritual authority, shared work, and eventually institutions. Scholars still debate how direct this connection is, and no single explanation fully accounts for the rise of states or cities. But it is difficult to ignore the pressure water places on human cooperation. A canal cannot be maintained by a single household forever. A levee, even a simple one, asks people to act together or fail separately. At the same time, water defeats certainty. Ancient people can learn patterns with extraordinary skill, but they cannot command every flood. A river may rise higher than elders remember. A storm may strike at the wrong season. A channel may silt up and abandon fields. Salt may creep into irrigated ground if drainage fails. A wetland may expand and bring disease. A harbour may fill with sediment. A coast may erode. What survives in the record suggests that many early societies lived not in stable harmony with nature, but in constant negotiation with forces they understood partly and feared deeply. Their achievements are impressive because the ground beneath them was never entirely obedient. There is a lesser-known irony in the story of irrigation. Water control can create prosperity, but it can also create new dangers. Irrigated fields may produce more food, supporting larger populations and denser settlements. Yet in dry regions, repeated irrigation can leave salts behind in the soil, slowly weakening productivity if not carefully managed. Canals can spread water, but also disease and pests. Centralized storage can protect against hunger, but also attract raiders or create inequality. The techniques that help people survive one problem can deepen another. Civilization is not simply the conquest of nature, it is a chain of compromises with consequences. The people around the old Black Sea margins may not have built cities in the later sense, but their experience belongs to the prehistory of this bargain. They lived near productive edges. They may have depended on fish, wetlands, river mouths, plants, animals, and possibly early cultivation or exchange. When the water rose, it revealed the hidden cost of trusting abundance too much. The richest edge is often low. The easiest land to use is often the easiest land to drown. That lesson repeats across the ancient world in many forms, from river floods to coastal storms to collapsing irrigation systems. As communities grow larger, memory of disaster becomes part of social life. Flood markers, stories, rituals, seasonal calendars, sacred river ceremonies, and rules about where to build may all preserve hard-won knowledge. Some of that knowledge is practical. Some becomes religious. The line between them is not always clear. If a river's behavior decides whether children eat, then river worship is not superstition in the shallow sense. It is a way of giving moral and emotional shape to dependence. People honor what can destroy them because ignoring it is impossible. The Black Sea story also reveals how environmental change can be uneven in its effects. A flood may ruin one community while enriching another. A new shoreline can create fresh fishing grounds. A shifted river can destroy old fields and fertilize new ones. A group forced from lowland homes may bring skills to another region, while those already living there may gain labor, knowledge, or competition. Catastrophe is rarely equal. It rearranges advantage. This may be one reason ancient societies often respond to environmental stress with both innovation and conflict. Scarcity and opportunity arrive together. By the time cities appear in the ancient world, humans have already lived through thousands of years of shoreline retreat, river instability, climate shifts, and local disasters. The grand monuments of later civilization can make people forget this older fragility. Stone temples and walls seem permanent. Written records seem confident. Kings claim order, but beneath them lies the same truth faced by small communities at the drowned shore. Human order depends on landscapes that are always changing. The palace is only as safe as the river's mood, the harvest's timing, the canal's flow, the coast's endurance, the rain's arrival. This does not make civilization foolish. It makes it brave, and sometimes overconfident. To build beside water is to accept risk for the sake of life. Without rivers and coasts, many early societies could not have grown as they did. Without floodplains, there is less grain. Without deltas, fewer reeds, fish, birds, roots, and fertile mud. Without maritime edges, fewer exchanges across distance. The danger is inseparable from the gift. People do not gather beside water because they misunderstand it. They gather because it is worth fearing. The mega-flood, then, is not only a memory of destruction, it is a mirror held up to the foundations of human history. The same forces that drown villages also make civilization possible. The same moving water that erases old shores lays down new soil. The same unstable margins that scatter people also connect them. Human beings learn to live in that tension, building homes, fields, myths, and eventually cities on ground that has never promised to stay still. The drowned Black Sea shore is one early example of a much older rule. History grows fastest where the earth is fertile, and the earth is often most fertile where it is least secure. The memory of water survives because water leaves two kinds of traces. One is physical shells in mud, drowned channels, old beaches beneath modern seas, pollen locked in sediment, chemical shifts that reveal when fresh water became saltier, when marsh became bay, when land became seafloor. The other is human stories of a world covered, warnings about building too low, rituals performed beside rivers, names attached to vanished places, myths in which survival depends on carrying life through water. The Black Sea flood stands at the meeting point of these traces. It is neither only geology nor only legend. It is a reminder that human history has always rested on landscapes older, larger, and less stable than human memory wants to believe. By now, the drowned shore has become more than a lost coastline. It has become a question about how people remember catastrophe before writing. The communities that may have lived along the old basin did not leave us tablets explaining what they saw. They did not draw maps of the shore as it retreated. They did not measure the Bosporus threshold or mark the first arrival of salt water. What survives in the record suggests change, disruption, and environmental transformation. But the human voices are gone. That absence is part of the haunting power of the story. The flood may have changed lives profoundly, yet the people most affected remain almost invisible, known only through inference and the kinds of places humans usually choose to live. This invisibility should not make them feel unreal. Every ancient disaster begins as somebody's present tense, before it becomes a layer of sediment. It is a problem of food, shelter, fear, and decision. Before it becomes a hypothesis, it is a shoreline that no longer behaves. Before it becomes a myth, it is a family carrying what can be saved away from ground that cannot be saved. The Black Sea flood, whether sudden or gradual, catastrophic or staged, points back to that human scale. It asks us to imagine not only the movement of water, but the smaller movements that follow hands lifting tools from a wet floor, people climbing toward higher ground, children being told not to walk where elders once walked freely. Scholars still debate the speed, scale, and exact sequence of the Black Sea's transformation, and that debate matters. Without careful evidence, the story becomes too easy, too polished, too eager to turn uncertainty into spectacle. The strongest version of the mystery is not the most exaggerated one. It is the version that allows mud, shells, submerged landforms, and ancient stories to remain complicated. No single explanation fully accounts for every clue. A major reconnection may have occurred. Shorelines were drowned. Salinity changed. Human community in the region were living through a wider age of warming, rising seas, and cultural transformation. But the exact relationship between flood, migration, farming, and myth remains partly hidden, like the old shore itself. That uncertainty is not emptiness. It is the shape of deep history. The farther back we go, the more the record thins, and the more carefully imagination must work beside evidence. Too little imagination, and drowned worlds become sterile diagrams. Too much, and they become fantasy. The Black Sea demands the narrow path between them. It asks for a mind that can see a sediment core and also understand that somewhere above the layer it represents. People may have once watched birds rise over reeds at dawn. It asks us to accept that the past can be both scientifically testable and emotionally unreachable. The legacy of the flood also lies in how it changes the idea of civilization. Human societies often tell stories of mastery fields cleared, animals domesticated, rivers channeled, cities built, kings crowned, laws written. But beneath those stories is a deeper vulnerability. The land itself changes, seas rise, rivers shift, droughts return, volcanoes darken skies, ice melts far away and alters shores where no one has seen ice for generations. The flood reminds us that civilization does not grow outside nature. It grows inside a moving system. Every settlement is an agreement with forces that never fully sign the agreement back. In that sense, The old Black Sea shore is not only prehistoric, it is familiar. Modern people still build on coasts, deltas, reclaimed wetlands, river plains, and storm paths because those places remain useful, beautiful, fertile, and connected. The same attraction that drew ancient communities to water draws people still. Ports grow where seas meet land. Cities rise where rivers bring trade. Farms spread across floodplains. The ancient lesson has not expired. It has only become larger. What happened at the end of the Ice Age unfolded without satellites, tide gauges, climate models, or written archives. Today, the world can measure rising seas with extraordinary precision, yet measurement does not make loss simple. A shoreline on a graph still becomes someone's home. A lesser-known legacy of post-Ice Age flooding is the realization that archaeology may be missing some of its most important chapters. Many early human stories may lie offshore migration routes, camps, fishing places, ritual sites, shell middens, burial grounds, and settlements now buried beneath marine sediment. The visible record is biased toward what stayed dry. The sea has edited the archive, and it has edited it severely. This means the story of human origins, movement, and settlement may always be partly incomplete until submerged landscapes are explored more fully. The Black Sea is one piece of a much larger missing library. Still, loss is not the whole inheritance. People survived. They moved, adapted, learned new shores, built new lives, and carried memory forward in altered form. If flood stories endured, they did so because survival endured with them. The human response to catastrophe was not only grief, it was rebuilding. It was finding higher ground, new water, new paths, new neighbours, new foods, new meanings. The world changed, and people changed with it. That capacity is one of the oldest features of humanity, older than cities, older than writing, older than any named civilization. So the mega-flood that changed human history forever may not be one clean event with one simple lesson. It may be a convergence, Ice Age water returning to the sea, a threshold possibly failing, a basin transforming, shore communities adapting, memories shifting into story, and later science trying to read the marks left behind. Its power lies in that convergence. It shows how deep time touches human time, how geology enters myth, how climate enters migration, how water enters memory. Beneath the Black Sea's surface, the old land remains beyond reach, but not beyond meaning. It is still there in the shape of the basin, in the argument of scholars, in the mud lifted from the seafloor, and in the ancient human fear that the world we know may not always remain above water. And so the story slows, as all flood waters eventually slow. The roar fades into depth, the shore stops moving, the new sea settles into its basin, and generations are born who never see the vanished land except through memory. What was once a path becomes water. What was once a camp becomes darkness. What was once a warning becomes a story told in another place, under another sky, by people who may no longer know exactly where it began. The Black Sea keeps its silence well. Its surface can look calm, even ordinary, while beneath it lie old river valleys, buried beaches, and the suggestion of lives lived before the water reached them. That is the strange tenderness of drowned history. It is not gone in the way fire turns wood to ash. It is present and unreachable. It waits under weight, under silt, under centuries of storms and ships and changing names. Human beings have always lived close to edges, the edge of forest and plain, the edge of river and field, the edge of sea and shore. These places feed imagination because they feed life, but they also remind life of its limits. To settle near water is to trust a boundary that water itself does not recognize forever. The ancient people of the drowned Black Sea world learned that truth without instruments, without written forecasts, without the language of climate or geology. They learned it by watching familiar ground disappear. What remains is not certainty, but a deep pattern. Landscapes change, people endure, memory bends, but it does not always break. Somewhere beneath the modern waves, the old shore still rests in darkness, holding its shells, its mud, its buried channels, and perhaps the faintest traces of human hands. Above it, the sea moves quietly in moonlight, as if nothing had ever been lost, and yet the loss is there, folded into the water, waiting for anyone who looks long enough to understand that history is not only built from what survives on land. Sometimes it is shaped most powerfully by the places the sea has taken back,